is the Jake for the State podcast, and this is the call for every red-blooded, God-fearing, liberty-loving patriot to prepare yourself, take your position, stand your ground, and advance the cause of freedom. Let's go.
All right, welcome to the Jake for the State podcast. I have today a special guest, Natalie Bruno. She is the libertarian candidate for the gubernatorial race here in Oklahoma. Thank you for being here, Natalie.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jake. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, it's an interesting race, as is, I think, most races in Oklahoma, but you got to appreciate the governor race, and especially as kind of the third party in the state. And honestly, I wanted to have you on because I think most people forget. All of the attention gets focused on the Republican, the Democrat, and they forget that there's actually a third option. Mm-hmm. And so I really wanted to have you here to remind people that there are a large group and growing group here in Oklahoma, the libertarians, who have really a position that you could say is between the conservative position, the liberal position. You might call it balanced. You might call it fair. I don't know. There's so many areas and ways that I agree with the libertarian position, and might even consider myself libertarian in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But there are some differences too. And so I'd love to just have a conversation with you to talk about why you're running, who you are, what your vision is for Oklahoma, the libertarian view of some of these positions, from healthcare to cannabis to, the judicial system here in Oklahoma. So love to hear your thoughts on these, but let's start with just give me a little background in the audience, a background on who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I was a military brat. My father was in the Army for 32 years. Wow. I always like to joke with people that he probably has every single ribbon and medal that you can even think of. He had an amazing work ethic, which is, I like to think where I picked that up from. And so after that, we ping-ponged all over the place like military families do. I've lived in Texas, California, Florida, Germany, which I really appreciate. And I think it's helped me a lot, especially in my race, because it has made me very cultured and has allowed me to experience different types of cultures, different perspectives, way different governments work in different states, or even different countries. And then I moved back when I was 18, and I've been here ever since. I'm not going to say how long that's been. But my husband and I have a blended family of 6 children. So I have 2 twin daughters that have autism, and then but high-functioning autism. And then I have 2 stepsons and my 2 birth-born sons. And from like a professional standpoint, on my history, I'm in marketing and advertising, and I've been in that space for about 17 years. I've been in leadership that whole time in different capacities. Started a newspaper actually, and ended up being a publisher at one point, and then moved over to radio, and then moved over to the agency world, which I love. I love helping businesses. And then I've been huge within the philanthropy space. I love children. Obviously, I have a ton of them. But I've also been a basketball and soccer coach for well over 6 years. I'm the chair for the associate board for Oklahoma Lawyers for Children. I was a CASA volunteer for a long time in Carter County. And then I do a lot of work within the criminal justice space.
Man, it's wonderful. It's a full life.
It is.
And you actually, with your marketing background, you helped with the Jorgensen campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the things that are kind of funny. People see, they're like, oh, this is the first time you're running for office. This is your first bad at politics. I'm like, actually, I've just been behind the scenes in politics for a while. Right. So I was the marketing director for Jo Jorgensen and her presidential campaign this last election. I won her endorsement, which should be posted today, I think, which she doesn't really endorse very many candidates. So that makes me feel good. Right. But yeah, so it's allowed me to run a lot of things on the back end, which has also helped my campaign because, as you've mentioned, being a third party, we do not have the resources, the PACs and stuff that the original 2 parties have. And so being able to do a lot of stuff myself has helped tremendously.
Yes, exactly. I did the same thing in mine. And a big part of that was wanting to control the message. Mm-hmm. And I'm just a hands-on guy. And so I like to even do my own graphics, and for better or for worse. Right. But I enjoy that part of it. So what made you want to run for governor of Oklahoma?
Yeah. So I like to jokingly say I don't know if I necessarily wanted to run.
Right.
I was asked to run, and then I felt influenced to run. So whenever you're in the nonprofit space, and I'm sure that you can probably appreciate this too, coming from a pastoral background, there's only so many things that you can do to help people, and only so many things you can do without hitting those legislative barriers, right? And so it got to a point, especially when I got more involved with the criminal justice aspect of things, that I was like, okay, until we get in there and actually start making some of these changes happen from a legislative standpoint, nothing's really going to change. We're just slapping Band-Aids on things. And then, some people have asked, well, why did you just jump straight to governor? Why didn't you run for senator or anything like that? Which we almost ran against each other. I don't know if you remember that for State District 22 when you ran the first time in the special election.
Okay.
But I ended up... there was a weird rule where I was living in my house for the appropriate amount of time, but I didn't re-register because I had moved 2 blocks over. Right. And so it was a weird kind of deal, so I wasn't able to run. But
knocked out a couple of people, a few people.
Yeah, it did. That was crazy how that happened. Yeah. But anyways, so I really thought about it anyways, and if I were to have ran for a state senate or a House of Representative position, being a libertarian, I wouldn't have been able to get very much done. We are such a divided, and you can speak to this. It's very divided and very difficult. So imagine being a complete minority and trying to make that happen. So I was like, the most I would be able to do would be from a governor's standpoint, because then I have the power to veto. I have the power to really influence the legislation as a whole a lot more so than I would have been able to just as a state senator or as a House of Representatives individual.
Right. And I so appreciate that. You're exactly right. I mean, the Senate and the House are dominated by the Republicans, and as a true conservative, I would say, I had difficulty getting a lot of stuff done, and so there is an aspect of this whole political game where you have to be in good graces with the right people and the right groups to really get things through. And unfortunately, I think that gets in the way of doing business for the people, really representing the ones who elected you. And I just refuse to play those political games. So, again, for better or for worse. But I think that, holding your principles and values above all else is so critical, especially with all of the corruption that tends to happen with people that get into office. That's why I was determined not to be corrupted, not to be to allow any compromise in my values. And so I think I did that successfully. I can appreciate someone who holds their values strong.
Yeah,
and
I actually agree with that. Being actually in your district, I was actually surprised you didn't win re-election. Yeah. But for me, I hear that all the time in regards to, well, yeah, you say you're different, but how do we know? Because we're lied to all the time. And so what I tell people, because I like to think myself as pretty funny in general, but I always try to make things relatable. And I'm like, guys, running as a third party is tough. Okay. You are coming into it knowing that you're at a disadvantage. I very easily, I have great relationships with people, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side here in the state, that have both asked me, hey, why don't you come and change to our party? We could get behind you then. Right. But my thing is guys, if I'm running as a third party, that means I stand for what I stand for. Yeah. Because otherwise I just would have changed parties and made life easier on myself if it was just about getting elected. Exactly. But I actually want to see real legislative change. Yeah. And so, as you've mentioned, it was important for you, it's important for me, and especially even more so within that governor space. Obviously, I came and chatted with you while you were senator, talking about, or while you still are, about agriculture things. Right. I've gone and talked to a ton of different legislators, and I will say for the record, you and I never had this conversation, but I had a conversation with many other people, especially while I was there for that week during the Julius Jones debacle. Right. That didn't feel like they could get things done. They were worried about retaliation from the current governor. They were worried about retaliation from other people. They're afraid to speak their mind. And that's really sad, because I think that all of these people come into it with the best of intentions, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to make change. And then they get there and it's nope. Yeah. Doesn't work that way. And it's really tricky.
It is. I keep it simple. And, one thing I always say is that if you have to have it, you're a dangerous person. And you're easily corrupted. And, when people are saying, oh, it's really difficult because they're trying to navigate pleasing this person or this crowd or getting reelected, that's the open door for corruption.
Yep.
So once all of that is set aside and it's simply principle, what is right and wrong on this issue, and you have the guts enough to stand for it, things get very simple.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you start trying to please men that things get complicated. So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's my position. What are your top issues? I know on your website you have a list of things that you had listed out, but you said those aren't necessarily your top issues. Those
right.
are the questions you're asked most. And but what would you say are the number one on your priority list, things that you would like to see changed in the state?
Yeah. So you're exactly right. What I tried to do as a candidate that you don't see very often is so many times people will try to hide answers that they don't think that the masses will approve of.
Right.
But I always from the get-go try to be very transparent. So if I was starting to get lots of questions about one thing, I went ahead and created a spot for it on my website so that way we could just drive people there. If I were to say absolute top issues, which it's hard when you live in a state like Oklahoma and we're struggling in so many areas. It's like playing whack-a-mole a little bit. But I would absolutely say mental health. So I say healthcare in general because I feel like there's lots of things within that space. The mental health capacity of things is huge for us. Domestic violence, which also has to do with a lot of times substance abuse and stuff. All those things can kind of be tied into mental health and health. So it's kind of like a big bucket right there. Yeah. Criminal justice reform. We are struggling in so many areas within that space. It's really, really difficult. And then obviously, I'm a parent, so without saying education and knowing where we stand educationally, that would be kind of hard. So those would probably be my top 3 high-level issues with knowing that there's tons of things within those that we could talk probably for a bazillion hours on.
Right, exactly. Let's start with mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Something I'm very passionate about. All of these things that you just mentioned: mental health, criminal justice, education. I think it's a great top 3 list. Like you said, there are subcategories underneath each of those categories, and then there are so many others. And many of these are what you might call hot button issues for the general public, where people can get fixated on a certain issue when there may be more important issues to be talking about. But right now in this day, this is what the people want to address. So
right, absolutely.
And some of that's driven by media and how it's covered and social media, blast and things like that.
Yes.
But on your top 3, mental health, why do you think mental health, first of all, do you agree that mental health is an issue, or do you think it's hype? Or, is it an actual issue in our world that we're facing? And then if so, what do you think is the best solution for it?
Yeah, so I absolutely believe that mental health is a big issue, and I think that some of it is kind of self-inflicted. When it comes to how we've kind of created this mess, I'll kind of say there's lots of things that tie into it. There's a lot more medications and things that we're on that affect us in different ways, right? The expectations and the constant media and social media and watching of things that we traditionally didn't have, those kinds of things we had to worry about, adding into anxiety. I think it's just kind of evolved us into having some more of these issues.
Yeah.
And then from a veteran standpoint too, our veteran mental health issues have gone through the roof. Suicide rates within veterans have gone up 36%. COVID exacerbated a lot of mental health issues, being isolated, being fearful, having everything politicized. And even within that space has been crazy. We have, people that essentially their entire military career were dealing with going overseas. This generation of soldiers has been deployed more times than any other generation ever. And so all of these little tiny things all over the place create a giant snowball issue. And so now we kind of have to, make the bed that we've created, right? And so there's this huge need for mental health services, for therapy, for counseling, and things like that. But we are at a huge deficit when it comes to providers. We also have issues where even like free services and stuff that people try to provide, like free clinics and things like that, they're 6-8 months in the rears. And then when you do have free healthcare for low income, it's typically only for women who are pregnant, extremely low income, and, those who can wait the 6 to 8 months, essentially. And so you have this big group of the middle class or upper lower class that get left behind. And so they're not able to get the medications they need. They're not able to get the therapy and help that they need. And even the wealthy aren't, or the people who have insurance. I myself, I make decent money. I have a large family, and I have health insurance. And whenever I went to go try to get, one of our sons evaluated for ADHD, everywhere it's like a 6 to 8 month wait list. I had to call my daughter, who also had ADHD at 17, her old doctor from like 15 years ago. I'm like, can you please get a son? I can't wait 6 to 8 months, and so it's a huge issue. And with mental health too, it's one of those domino issues where mental health affects crime, mental health affects education, mental health affects all sorts of different things, substance abuse. And so we're looking at, okay, our education is struggling, our criminal justice is struggling, we have substance abuse problems, we have all of these different things. That's definitely a microcosm of something that we could address that could ripple and kind of help address some of these things. It doesn't fix them, but it'll help overall.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back. I probably should ask this question at the beginning, but the thing that defines a libertarian, I would say it would be small government.
Yes, absolutely.
It's like get the government out of our lives so we can be about our business. So with that in mind, and would you add anything to that? Anything that is a key characteristic of a libertarian in addition to that? Or do you think that's kind of the main thing?
I mean, that's really, if you were to try to summarize it in really short, digestible amount, that's pretty much what it is. Making government as small and minimal as possible. Yes. Making sure, so there's different levels of libertarian, I would say, just like with anything else, right?
Exactly.
We have extreme anarchists within the libertarian platform. Then we have ones that are far more conservative. And I myself am a very conservative libertarian, and that I know it's unrealistic to have no government, at least for me,
right?
Especially not in the next 4 to 8 years, right? But there's absolutely ways that we can restructure government and make decisions smaller and closer to home than federal, and pretty much going that direction,
right? And I think that's the main area where we align, and a lot of conservatives would align with you, is understanding that we do need a measure of government, but we want it small, staying in its lane. And we're seeing it constantly growing, with a Republican legislature, we're constantly growing government.
Yes.
And it's it's in these subtle ways, and usually through other agencies or bureaucratic, branches, but that's still government funded. And so I have a big problem with that, and I think that it is a runaway train, and we've got to get it under control. So I totally agree with you there. But going back to our other issue of healthcare, what do you believe then is the appropriate role of government in healthcare? Do you believe healthcare is a right? Do you believe, what is the limit of government involvement in our healthcare?
So, and that's really a tricky question, because of the fact that the reason that we have issues with healthcare, just like, and I feel the same way with education, is because government got so involved that it muddied everything up. And now we're like, okay, how are we going to fix this? Because the reason that people can't afford things without insurance is because insurance got involved. And they're like, so, our people are just going to pay these deductibles, and then you can just charge whatever, and we're going to pay it. And so the hospitals, of course, because they want to make money, they're like, all right, well, your insurance is going to pay for it. So this surgery that really probably would only cost about $6,000, we're going to go ahead and charge it and make it like $100,000. Right. And so going to an actual, and again, when I say these things, I know that we realistically can't flip a switch and go straight to a free market healthcare system, right? There's things that we're going to have to do to move ourselves that direction. But the closest thing to that we've seen is LASIK eye surgery or cosmetic surgery, okay? So LASIK eye surgery, because of the fact that it almost very rarely gets covered by insurance, you know exactly how much it's going to cost. The people talk about it on the radio or on their websites. You can go and I can go get laser eye surgery for $599 and that's it, and I'm done, because they have to make it affordable, because they know that everyday people have to be able to pay for it out of pocket. Same thing with cosmetic surgery. If you were to take what they do in some cosmetic surgeries, and if it would have been like a hospital ran covered, the prices would be night and day, because they have to make it affordable for everyday people to be able to afford to use it. And so within that, LASIK space, one example I like to use, so I could go and get laser eye surgery on both of my eyes, and I know exactly what's going to cost, $599, that's it. But yet when I had a root canal done with very good insurance last year, it was like $700 and something, my amount after insurance just to get a root canal done. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So, that's a perfect example of we let government get involved. It made everything crazy. And then now we're going to have to somehow figure out how to fix that. And some people have different ideas on how to do it. I'm still listening for it. I love Dr. Smith over at Oklahoma Surgery Center. I don't know if you've heard of him or heard of. So he's a libertarian. He spoke at our last convention. And his whole process is set up on the fact that you can literally call them and ask for the price of any procedure, any surgery, anything. And they have competitive, fair prices. Like, they literally will have someone who, perfect example, I wish I knew about them whenever I went through my bilateral mastectomy, because I'm a breast cancer survivor.
Yes.
And so it was, oh my gosh, I want to say before insurance kicked in, it's like $150,000. Like, it was something crazy.
Right.
Wherein I was talking to him offline one time, and he said for that same surgery that he would have been done if somebody would have called and said, hey, they want me to do this surgery, how much is it? It would have been like $15,000 or something like that.
Right.
Because he's like, we don't inflate all the crazy prices. I mean, so if we could just go to getting government out of things, we'd be able to afford most of this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't think we need more government to fix it. I think we just need to back government out of it. And then it becomes free market, and it begins to regulate itself.
Absolutely.
I think that's the problem with so many of these things, is that government got involved, it became a mess, so we think that more government is the answer. More regulation. And it's not. You have to back it out. It will naturally regulate itself for supply and demand.
Absolutely.
So I do have an opinion on that and solution, I believe. I think a lot of people are thinking, how do we create alternative systems to the current system? And we're seeing more nurses, doctors leaving the corporate system to go start their own practices, independent from all of these things, and think about, how do we make this work outside of insurance, outside of big pharma, so that we can truly control our own practice, our own business, set our own prices, and help the people, which is why we got into this. I talk to people a lot, and so I actually started one. I'll make a little plug for my deal. It's called Paraclete. You can go to paraclete.org, PARAKLETE.org. And so this is an alternative insurance system to help provide for those services that insurance doesn't typically cover, that actually produce true health, like nutritional counseling, like life coaching, financial counseling, these kind of hormone balancing, naturopath services. So these things are outside of the current healthcare system. Therefore, they're not covered by traditional insurance. Therefore, most people don't go that route because it's more expensive.
But they're actually way more impactful. I love that.
Yes.
I absolutely love that.
I'm excited about it. It's gaining momentum. We're expanding our network of providers. More people are hopping on. But that's just a little example of how we go outside the current system, think outside the box. We need to be at the Capitol lobbying for change, but at the same time, we have to be out in the marketplace creating something separate from government. Absolutely. Not waiting for government permission, or waiting for a policy or a new law, but simply going out, using the freedom that we have to start new businesses, start alternative systems. So I think it requires both. That's where I'm constantly pushing people to think, is like, hey, what can you do with what you have? And I think we all have something we can do something with.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate and admire anybody running for office, because the reality is anybody can. It's just a few are crazy enough and bold enough to actually go do it,
Right.
But once you do, you realize the brokenness of the system, but you realize how much freedom we still have. And it all it takes is a stepping up. And as long as we think that we are limited and we're victims and we're dependent on government, we'll stay in our house waiting on permission to leave. But the fact is, you can leave anytime you want. And we better get out and start acting, or that day is coming where we may not be able to leave.
Absolutely.
So let's look at this. Speaking of shutting people down, looking at the criminal justice system.
Yes.
So what are the problems that we see in Oklahoma, and what do you think is the solution?
Well, how much time do you have?
I know, exactly.
No, so Oklahoma, gosh, there's so many things. So this is something I'm extremely passionate about for multiple reasons. We have situations where we We were number one for incarcerating women, but now we're number two. I believe it was Louisiana that recently passed us up, but we're number two in incarceration rates altogether. We sentence our nonviolent crimes 78% longer. We have one of the top rates for people who were given the death penalty but then were exonerated because they later ended up being found to be innocent.
Right. Such a tragedy, yeah.
It's a huge tragedy. We also, 6 times the national average, sentence people to life sentences than any other state on a federal level, which is also crazy. So we have these situations where we think that being hard on crime makes it to where we're safer, but as I don't know if you watched the gubernatorial debates that I was not invited to on it was a little disappointing. I would have I feel confident I would have destroyed them on that stage, but but Joy Hoffmeister actually brought up a point that Stitt didn't even believe, that was fact checked, and I actually knew it to be true, that we actually have higher crime rates than New York and California. And we don't know that. We also have one of the highest amounts of civilians that are killed by police. And I'm not anti-police. I'm just pointing out we have all of these issues within our space. And there's so many reasons for it, too. We've had judges and DAs and stuff that have had no accountability previously, historically. And that's an issue that we see across the board. People are not being held accountable for the bad decisions and bad choices that they make. We have situations where we have private prisons, and so we have people that are making money off of inmates. We have situations like I currently have a oh my goodness, complete brain fart. I have a thing on my website called Joshua's Law, where you write down signatures, and I'm having a brain fart on what that is called right now. Petition. There we go. Petition. Sorry. I haven't had enough coffee yet this morning. And it's a Friday. I'm going to use that as my excuse. But essentially, the phone call system. A lot of people don't realize that 70% of the families of people who are incarcerated have an average household income of around $25,000 to $30,000 a year.
Right.
Okay. And so to have just a 15-minute phone call back home is $15. And you think about, yes, the individuals who are incarcerated, they did something, most of them, that caused them to be behind bars, but the families are being punished too. So you have children and loved ones that are literally having to decide if they want to be able to talk to their dad and tell them about how their week did, or, pay a bill. Because $15 for a phone call for a family that's low of income, that's huge.
Yeah, could be a meal or two. Yeah.
It absolutely could. And it has been, proven through multiple case studies that the more interactions that inmates have with their family on the outside, the better behaved they are. The more focused and stuff that they are. And then it also helps the family on the outside tremendously. That connection is important. And, I guess it depends on if you're an individual that believes in prison being a form of rehabilitation, or if you're a person that believes that prison is just purely supposed to be to, punish you and be miserable. But
that's what I was going to say is, I think that we do tend to be more punitive and punishment focused rather than rehab focused. And I'm a huge believer in redemption and grace. God gave us grace. I believe in giving grace to others. And at the same time, protecting the general public from offenders, especially violent offenders. And we can talk about that, about the victimless versus victim crimes. But, at the same time, while they're in there, what are we doing to give them hope of change, to equip them? What was driving them to commit the crime in the first place? Like you were saying, they're usually in poverty. And so are they robbing out of desperation, which results in a murder? What is it? And it doesn't mean they're innocent, but it means that, are we focusing on the solution? Or are we just dealing with the symptom and trying to control the crime without dealing with the solution, the root cause? And so I'm a huge believer in that. I think that's definitely an area we need to work on here in Oklahoma. So victimless crimes. So we're talking about like drugs.
Right.
Right now we're seeing Biden trying to pardon, and I forget her name now, I was drawing a blank, the basketball star over there in the foreign country.
Of course you would ask me that too.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. I'm drawing
oh my
a blank,
gosh, what is her name?
So she is in jail because of cannabis, because of marijuana, and now Biden is trying to pardon her, get her released, and extradited back here United States. But then the big question on everybody's mind is, what about everybody in the
Yeah,
United
it's like,
States?
hello, what about the
who's behind
thousands and
bars?
thousands and thousands of people here?
Exactly. So I think that opens up a great can of worms in the conversation of, okay, what are we doing about those here in Oklahoma? Let's just bring it to our state. How do we feel about cannabis, about victimless crimes? Where do you stand on, let's start with victimless crimes and then we'll talk about cannabis.
Yeah, so victimless crimes in general. So when we think about why jails were originally created, right? They were originally created so then that way you could protect the community until a trial was set from somebody that would potentially be dangerous, right? And so we kind of have since then, like most things, everything had a best intention in the beginning and then the government gets involved and just screws everything up. And I believe that this is absolutely the case when it comes to victimless crimes, because are these things that people should actually be put in prison for? Gambling, sex work, drugs, all of those things, they're, depending on your view, even from a morality standpoint, they're only hurting the individual. But you're making things 10 times worse when you're throwing the people in jail, because then you're infecting their family. They went from a 2-income family to a 1-income family, or a 1-income family to now you have kids in foster care. You have situations where, as we see with alcoholism, and I'm going to say I went to school for alcohol and substance abuse counseling, so I have a very interesting perspective in that, right. Because especially with my CASA work, I can honestly say that in the whole time I was a CASA, every single time that a child was removed from the home, it had something to do with drugs or alcohol, right? But it makes it so much harder once people do hit their bottom and they do decide that they want to get clean or they want to make changes. It's so much harder when you've slapped felonies on their record or you've hit all these barriers on their record that prohibits them then from being able to join the workforce. If someone used to be an alcoholic, but then they changed their life, they can go and apply for any kind of job and there is no constant red flag on their history because they decided to be an alcoholic. But for drugs there is. And it's really unfortunate that we have monetized people struggling or choosing different ways of life, or even things like I said, like gambling. If somebody decides to play poker with their friends or run a poker business, why, obviously it's probably just the reason that we're not pulling the tax dollars out of it, but there's ways to fix that too. And if we so feel inclined, even though I obviously am against that taxation, right. But it's again, another form of the government trying to go in and muddy into areas that they have no involvement. Just because you don't feel like people should be doing something doesn't mean that the government should be going in and making laws about it.